Good morning. Today we are reviewing Unit 5, making sure we're ready for our test. So our Unit 5 starts at CO36. I interpret and write mathematical and algebraic expressions with addition and subtraction. Remember when we did this objective, I said you're going to want to put this table on your help sheet because you're going to need to remember those keywords. So the keywords we know we're going to be adding if we see words like the sum, total, or plus. We know we are subtracting if we see difference. Less than, subtracted from, and subtracted by. Remember with this one, we had two that were starred. Those are the ones that we have to flip our numbers. So you can star it right on your help sheet and say something like flip numbers if you remember what that means, or you can put a little note to help you remember. So if it's 82 subtracted from 101, subtracted from is starred, so I know I need to put 101 first. So you need to remember to flip those because we're taking 82 away from that 101. So you want this table on your help sheet. Making sure we're starring the two that we need to remember to flip the numbers. Making sure that you put addition and subtraction at the top so you know what those words are telling us to do. CO37, same thing, except this time's multiplying and dividing. So we need those tables for multiplying and dividing. Label them so we know which words mean we multiply and which words mean we are dividing. So multiplying is a product, groups of, and times. Dividing is finding the quotient, or dividing into groups of. And remember, if there are fractions, that fraction bar means divide. So we didn't put that on when we were going through it. We talked about it. I would put it on your help sheet, remembering that fraction bar means divide. Hudson, do you not have a note card? Okay, are you writing the words out? So we need to remember which words mean multiply and which words mean divide. On the last objective, CO36, and on CO37, some of it is going to be writing the mathematical expression for the verbal phrase. Some of it is you're going to be given that mathematical expression and you need to write that verbal phrase. So you need to be able to do both. Figure out what the expression looks like, figure out what the verbal phrase would be. Any questions on either of those objectives? Okay. CO38. And if you didn't get all of this written down, you can watch the video tonight or look at your binder and finish it up. CO38, I can evaluate algebraic expressions using multiple operations. This is when it's very important that we remember PERMDAS that order of operations. So I would even put PERMDAS on your help sheet so you remember which steps to do first. So put PERMDAS. If you don't remember what PERMDAS means, write it out. But remember, when we're filling in our variables, if that number is right next to that variable, what operation does that automatically mean? Aiden? Times. So if you remember that, you don't have to write it. But if you're like, ooh, I keep thinking that 2a is 24, or I'm adding it, if you don't remember, you're going to want to write out if the number is next to the letter, you multiply. You can't write out an example of it, but you can write out what it means. So you need to remember, if the number is right next to the letter or right next to the parentheses, okay, number next to the letter, number next to the parentheses means you are multiplying. If we have that exponent on the outside of the parentheses, remember PERMDAS, you do inside the parentheses first, then you do that exponent. Remember, exponent does not mean multiply it by the 2. It means multiply the number by itself. So we see that number 2 times. Any questions on this one? So this is one where you rewrite your equation, your expression, putting that variable value in, and then doing the math, doing the order of operations. We had one like this on Khan Academy, and when people came to ask me for help, I said, make sure you have scratch paper, because you have to write it out. So you have to stop trying to do that mental math with it. When a big kid math, it gets complicated. So we're stopping some of that mental math for the big equations, filling stuff in, so we don't forget what we're doing. Write it out. PO 39, I can solve an equation with addition or subtraction. So PO 39 and PO 40, these are the easy ones, where you could do logic. What number plus 12 equals 19? You can do opposite operations, or you could do the fact families. So you could write for PO 39 and, is it PO 40 or CO 40? I think it's a PO. PO 39 and PO 40, you could write out logic question, opposite operations, or fact family. So you remember what to do to solve it. Some of us like doing that mental math with the logic problem. Some of us are starting to figure out how to do those opposite operations. Any of those work for these two. So PO 39 is addition or subtraction, and PO 40 was that multiplication or division. Remembering that if the number's right next to the letter, it means multiply. If it's a fraction bar, it means divide. We need to remember those things. For those two objectives, do the logic question, do the opposite operation, or do the fact family to solve your problem. Figure out what that missing number is. Any questions on these two objectives? They're basically the same, just doing different operations, but we solve them the same way. So then, we come to CO 41. I can evaluate expressions with fractions using addition or subtraction. Some of us are very confident with working with fractions, and we remember the steps. Some of us forget the steps to do. Do I do that when I add or subtract? Do I do that when I multiply or divide? If that is you, write out the steps on your help sheet. CO 41, when we are adding or subtracting, what's our first step? Adeline, find the common denominator. Whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So you have to, if you're multiplying the bottom by 2, you have to multiply the top by 2. Make sure that denominator is the same for both fractions. Second step, add or subtract the numerator. Denominator stays the same. So you only add or subtract the top. That denominator is the same number, it stays the same. What is our final step? When we're working with fractions, what's our final step, Sophie? Simplify. So step 3, simplify, simplify, simplify. You have to be able to divide the same number out of the top and out of the bottom. Sometimes we have to simplify a few times. Sometimes we just simplify it once. Sometimes it's already as simple as it gets. So you have to remember those rules of divisibility. Can I divide a 2 out of both of them? Can I divide a 3 out of both of them? How can I simplify? Any questions on adding or subtracting fractions? Which step did you need? Step 3? I think this was just add or subtract the numerator. 3 was simplify. So that's step 1 is common denominator. Step 2 is the add or subtract the top, just the numerator. Denominator stays the same. Step 3 is always simplify. Can I get any smaller for both the top and the bottom? CO42 is our multiplying or dividing those fractions. So if we are multiplying, when we multiply fractions, step 1 is multiply across. Step 2 is simplify. We need to remember to convert mixed numbers to improper. So you can't just leave, this is for adding or subtracting and multiplying and dividing. You can't just have mixed numbers. You got to convert them to improper so we can make sure we're getting the right answer. So if it's in mixed number, that 1 2/3, remember we multiply and then we add. Multiply and then add. Then you multiply across. Can't do that if we have a whole number thrown in there. Remember, if it is a whole number, you put a 1 under it. So we have a numerator and a denominator to multiply across. When we divide, we have a different first step. That first step is flip, divide to multiply, and flip second fraction. So if we're flipping, dividing to multiplying, that first fraction stays the same. That second fraction, you flip to its reciprocal. Now we multiply the same way, because now we're multiplying. So you multiply across, and you simplify. Remembering that we are converting those mixed numbers to improper. We are putting a 1 underneath whole numbers to make sure it's a fraction. So we don't want any whole numbers in there. Everything has to be a fraction, either improper or putting a 1 under that whole number. Any questions for this? Okay. All right. So let's look at our last objective. This is the one that I said we need to really make sure that we are following the steps so we don't forget steps. When we do two-step equations, you're going to want to put SADMER. Because remember, we are going opposite. When we do opposite operations to get to the opposite side of the equal sign, instead of going multiplying and dividing and then adding and subtracting, we start with that adding and subtracting and doing the opposite operation. Then we do the same thing for the multiply or divide. So if we look at that 5n plus 7 equals 32, we want to start with that adding or subtracting, doing the opposite. So instead of adding 7, we're going to subtract 7 from both sides. So we get the 5n equals 25. Now we're multiplying by 5, so we want to divide by 5 on both sides. 5 divided by 5 cancels out, so we have n equals 25 divided by 5, which is 5. So you do the opposite of the adding or subtracting, then you do the opposite of multiplying or dividing. Remembering negative numbers matter. So if there's a negative sign next to your number, you have to keep it with that number when you're adding or subtracting, when you're multiplying or dividing. So we have to work with negative numbers, so we can't forget those rules. So let's look at one of the ones on that second page. Let's look at this line. We had minus 16, so we're going to add 16 to both sides. So we have negative 11n equals 6 plus 16 is 22. Now we have negative 11, so we're dividing out that negative 11 on both sides because we want it to be a positive n. Negative divided by negative is a positive. Here we have a positive divided by a negative, so it's going. My answer is going to be negative. 22 divided by 11 is 2. So make sure you're paying attention to your negative rules when we're multiplying or dividing. Remember over here, we said, oh, if it's a 20 plus 22n, some people got confused and thought, well, we need to subtract 22 because we're adding 22. But we don't do that because that 22 is connected to the variable. That means we're multiplying the variable. We need to go to the number that doesn't have the variable first. But there's no adding or subtracting a 20. So we need to remember that means it's a positive 20. So we need to do the opposite of positive 20, which is negative 20, which is minus 20. So we have 22n equals 1210. Now we do our dividing to find our n, which would be 55. So remember, You always start with the number that doesn't have a variable next to it, whether it's the second number or it's the first number. You always do the number with no variable, add or subtract, doing that opposite operation. Then you take care of the number that's connected to the variable, multiplying or dividing, doing the opposite operation. Be careful of negative numbers. Okay? Remember those negative number rules. Any questions on the opposite operations? All right. Now, remember we always have a review section. So our review, if we look at the very front of our book, we will see our table of contents. We are on Unit 5. And down here it says M6R4. So M6 Review 4, which objectives are we going to have? Well, we're going to have PO4, PO12, PO28, and PO31. So we want to review those objectives. The first 3 are from Book 1. Remember I said don't get rid of that Binder 1, because we're going to need to review from it for some of these review problems. So PO4, 12, and 28 are from Binder 1. PO31 is from this Binder 2. So let's take a quick look at PO31, because we're going to have a question about it on the test. Whoops. PO31 is ordering fractions, decimals, and percentages. Who remembers what our first step was when we were putting these in order? Nolan P.
Turn all of the numbers into a percentage, fraction, or decimal?
Yeah, they should all be the same. So here we see a fraction, a percentage, a decimal. Oh my goodness, it's hard to compare those. How do I know which is smaller, which is bigger? If I put them all as fractions, all as percentages, or all as decimals, then I can compare them. I like to just turn it all into percents because my brain just likes doing percents. You don't have to do that. You can do all of them as decimals, all of them as fractions. What is the key number we need to remember when we're working with percents, Lila? 100. So you're going to that 100th place with your decimal. And here we see a 0.09. What percent would that be? James? What is it? 9%. Because that 9 is in that 100th place. Here we see a 9 in the 10th place. What percent is that, Lexi?
90%.
90, because we have to put a 0 in that 100th place. So 0.9 and 0.09 are very different, and very different percents. Remember, you need to go to the 100th place when you're working with percents. Any questions on this one? All right, let me call up book 1, and we have a few more minutes of class. Let's see if we can get some of those other ones reviewed. So PO4, estimating, rounding whole numbers and decimals. So we need to remember our place values. What's the rule for rounding? If we're rounding to the 100th place, we look at the 1,000th. If that 1,000th number is 4 or less, our 100th place stays the same. If that 1,000th place is 5 or more, raise the score, go up 1 more. So you have to remember place values, and you have to remember the rounding rules. Because it might ask you something like rounding to the 100 or rounding to the 100th. two very different places on our number line. So remember place values. If you're rounding to the whole, that's the ones place. All right, our next one, PO 12. PO 12 is I can write a fraction in its simplest form. Oof, we are simplifying in this test, so we should be able to simplify for our review question. Remember, you have to be able to divide out the same number from the top and the bottom. So you have to be able to simplify. And then we have 28. Went a little too far. All right, PO 28, I can write proportions and solve proportions. Remember, you put 2 cups over 3 batches. So you would have 2 cups over 3 batches. And then if it asks how many cups for 6 batches, you need to remember, line them up, cups over batches, cups over batches. How did I go from 3 to 6? I multiplied by 2, so I need to do the same to the top. So line up your proportions, and then figure out how did I go from one side to the other. If we don't know what we multiply by, then you divide backwards. Yes. Any other questions? All right. Practice test tomorrow. If we have questions from the practice test, make sure you're asking me so we can learn from it, learn from our questions, learn from the mistakes that we make on that practice test, make sure you understand what you did wrong so we can do it correctly on the real test. If you have that packet number 6, make sure you're turning it in to me. It's due today. Con is due tomorrow. Have a wonderful day if you are watching this at home.